Thank you guys for being here today, checking out our fourth episode of Three Good Questions. Today I've got two people that were my former professors, but I also consider really good friends, thankful for what they've done, for what they have also filled me up with and challenged me on a lot of levels. And I think it's going to be a really good conversation that we have today. So we'll start off, and we've got Lauren Smelser White. Lauren and I actually, we go way back to elementary school, so I still get used to the maiden, not using her maiden name sometimes. But if you will, Lauren, just say hi.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here.
And we've also got John Mark Hicks, who I've known for a good while. I've had John Mark on the doctoral level, but also knew him before that a little bit. John Mark, if you will, say hi.
Hello, glad to be here.
Yep. All right, well, Lauren, if you will, like I said, we go back a ways, all the way back to Mars Hill to Florence, Alabama. But if you would, kind of give everybody a fuller introduction of yourself.
Sure. So yeah, grew up at going to school with Grant, so I've known him for a long time at Mars Hill, which is in Florence, Alabama, a little Church of Christ school that a lot of people may, a lot of your people may know of actually. So went to Harding and majored in English, went on and did an MA in English at ACU and thought that was the path. But while I was doing that work, I realized I had this interest in theology and theological studies. So I ended up going in a totally different direction and doing an MTS at Vanderbilt, and then staying on there and doing a PhD in systematic theology. And so have really, that took a long time. I had a couple kids along the way. So finally finished that process in 2017 and started working at Lipscomb as an assistant professor of theology in January of 2018. So just wound up 2.5 years on faculty there. And that's where I got to reconnect with Grant when he was in the DMin program. I got to actually a really great course that John Mark and I have been able to co-teach in theological hermeneutics. So it was wonderful to reconnect with Grant and get to check back in with each other at this stage of life. So it's great to be here with you all.
Yeah, that was really interesting. We walked in and I was pretty sure that was you, and then we kind of checked in and it was like the first time I think we'd probably seen each other since in any kind of interaction since Mars Hill. So it was a really cool kind of the way that path kind of came back around and we connected again there. So, John Mark, what about you? A little bit fuller introduction.
Well, I'm John Mark Hicks, and I teach at Lipscomb University. I have been teaching in higher education of Churches of Christ since 1982. So that's a long time.
That was 1 year after I was born.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you saying that. I'm grateful. Yeah, I'm glad you've been alive that long. Yeah. But no, it's been I've enjoyed what I've done. I went to school at Freed Hardeman, so I went to the right school. So, and I've learned a lot from that. Grew up in Churches of Christ. My dad was a preacher. My mother was a teacher. My sister's a teacher. So I've been in the teaching game a long time and been at Lipscomb since 2000.
Yeah.
Taught for a while at Harding Graduate School in Memphis. In the 1990s.
Yeah. And if I'm right about this, your first teaching gig was here at Magnolia Bible College.
Well, it wasn't my first one, but it was, I taught in Alabama in Montgomery for 7 years before I came to Magnolia Bible College. Yeah. 1989. I was at Magnolia Bible College for a couple of years.
Okay, well, good. That's really neat. I'd have been a little bit older then. I would have remembered you if we'd have crossed paths.
Yeah, you keep talking like that, I'm gonna go away.
Well, we have some some of our members that were former board members at Magnolia and had memories of you there. And a lot of people in this state, people forget there's a lot of preachers in Mississippi that came through that program there. So thank you for.
Yeah, that's correct. I traveled all over the state and spoke in a lot of different churches in Mississippi. So yeah, those were some fond memories for me. Those were good years. Those were 2 good years.
Well, good, good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that your time in Mississippi was enjoyable. Well, we'll start. We'll just kind of roll into the questions that we have, and I'll start with you, John Mark. During this pandemic, many Christians have said their faith is greater than fear. How can Christians practice their faith while considering instructions from medical professionals, government officials, and public health organizations?
Well, that's pretty broad, but in a way, faith and fear, I would say that's generally true. Faith and fear are kind of the struggle we all live in.
Yeah.
Because we all have fear, and hopefully we're on the journey of faith. And so we're trying to navigate that, negotiate that all along the way. But maybe here also in our context of that kind of language, it's not so much fear we're talking about, but recklessness.
Yeah.
So faith and recklessness don't go together either. Because faith is a trust in what God is doing, but it's also a embrace of the responsibility as human beings, an embrace of the human vocation to be responsible with the creation, to be responsible with our families, to be responsible with our actions. And so, for example, I trust God, but I still wear a seatbelt.
Yeah.
I trust God and I take my prescribed medicines.
Yeah.
And I think it's similar to say, I trust God and I participate in social distancing, because there are people who know a whole lot more about it than I do, and who have an expertise in the field and a history of understanding the topic and what viruses do and don't do and what helps and what doesn't help. And since I'm not an expert, I think I have to learn how to trust other people who are experts.
Yeah.
And so it, just as my doctor says, here, this is going to help your blood pressure. Take this medicine. I say, okay, I'll give it a try. That doesn't diminish my faith to embrace the gifts of medicine.
Yeah.
And it doesn't diminish my faith to practice social distancing in a context where the non-practice of social distancing would harm my neighbor or create hospitalization problems or overload the hospital or whatever the scenario is. And we saw that in New York City, how it got overloaded. And so we have to be careful, but being careful is not a lack of faith. In fact, it's trusting in how God created the world, the way in which God created the world, and how we live in community and how we affect one another. And so having faith excludes recklessness and embraces responsibility. And at the same time, having faith means I'm going to love my neighbor. And if this is what it takes to love my neighbor right now, then okay, that's what I need to do. But it's not a lack of faith to do so.
Yeah. So fear, right, is not something that we don't want to be so afraid that it kind of takes over the faith that we have in God, the faith we have in God to provide ultimately the faith in what God is doing in the world and God's doing in us. But being responsible, you would say, is not the same thing as being afraid during this pandemic.
Exactly. I think to be responsible is, in fact, to live in faith. Because God has invested us with responsibility. And so to live responsibly is an expression of faith, not of fear. An expression of faith. Fear would be debilitating. It would be, I'm not going to do anything. I am paralyzed by the situation. But we're not paralyzed by the situation. We are taking actions and doing things that are responsible we are connecting in ways that we can,
Yeah.
and we are loving our neighbors in the decisions that we are making.
Yeah. Yeah. Lauren, what would you add to that?
I think all of that is really well said. Something I've, noticed is a few times I've noticed people saying that we should have faith that God will protect us. And I always think, we need to be careful with that kind of thinking. As Christians, the call is not a call to safety and protection. Ultimately, we're promised that God will redeem the creation, that God will set all things right, that God will bring resurrected life out of death for us. But in this life, the call is to face our death with confidence in that promise. It's not to think that God will somehow, protect us as kind of chosen special people in relation to non-Christians who don't have God's protection. So that's the one thing I also think in being wise and in trusting the instructions of our doctors. We also need to remember that we're not promised some sort of special protection just because we're godly people. But on the flip side of that, for those who are called to go in and work in situations that make them vulnerable to illness, that kind of faith can also sustain you in that work. That, if you do contract the illness and you do face death, this is the path we all have to walk at some point. And that promise of resurrection is there on the other side of it. So it can give us great confidence.
Yeah. Well, and I think of what you said, and not maybe taking advantage of this ideal, of this promise that Christians may have that God will protect us. I think of Jesus on the temple when Satan, that was one of the ways that Satan tempted Jesus, right? Was to throw himself off of the temple and let the angels catch him. And Jesus rejected that. And there could even be some of this and some of this attitude that we might pick up along the way. So,
yeah, I appreciate what Lauren said about those whose skills and who are equipped to help people. That love of neighbor drives that, right? As a Christian, I have the skills, so therefore I will take the risk.
Yeah.
Not taking the risk as a way of tempting God. I'm rather taking the risk as a way of loving my neighbor and loving God.
Yeah.
And we have people in all our congregations, I'm sure, who are involved in that. They're doctors or they're nurses or they're police persons, or whatever it is. They're all involved, in they're first responders of one sort or another. And they're not shrinking back from that. They are, in fact, pursuing their career and their vocation. And they do so at great risk.
Yeah.
But they do it for the sake of loving their neighbor, not as a way of tempting God, but God, they have been called by God into those situations.
Yeah. And those are two very different kinds of risk, right? The risk that I'm just going to go out and live my life and do what I want. God's going to take care of me. If I'm going to get this virus, I'm going to get this virus. That's one thing. And that's something I think that is not, if I'm hearing you guys correctly, it is not something that coheres with the way that we understand a biblical faith should be lived out, versus the risk of using our skills, walking into danger in order to love our neighbors more effectively.
Yeah, I think.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I appreciate your framing it that way, because there's a pretty big difference in the motive there, the sense of what God is calling us into. And so, and I love all the, in going through the pandemic, I keep seeing a lot of people sharing stories about how the church, John Mark had a great piece on this in our local Nashville news. I hope you saw, Grant, but about how churches have responded to pandemics and epidemics in the past. Yeah. And, this is one thing that's always been actually a great point of our, kind of solidifying our witness, is the way that those of us who are equipped to offer care do so with this confidence in the promise of resurrection. I mean, the church has grown a lot as a result. And this is, from its beginning, from its inception on until now. And the way Christians have been the ones willing to go into the most dire circumstances and care for those who are afflicted.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's really good. Joe Mark, were you going to add something else, or did that cover it?
I don't know that I remember what it was because Lauren's point was so well made there.
Yeah.
But I think maybe, yeah, those two different kinds of risk. The other risk is presumptive.
Mm,
I want to go out and just do my thing. And if I get it, I get it. And if I die, I die. It's okay. I'll be better off. That's
yeah.
kind of presumptive. And it's also dismissive of all the people who love you
Yeah.
and all that God will do with you over the next few years or in the coming years, that you're just going to just throw your life at risk and deny the grace that God may use through you in the future and the way your family. It is, I think you're exactly right. It is like, yeah, I'm just going to throw myself off the temple and see if God catches me. And if he
Yeah.
doesn't catch me, I'm going to die and go to heaven anyway. So,
Yeah.
really, Jesus didn't think of it that way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, and that is a good segue into our next question. Kind of during this time, most of our churches have forgone assembling together. There's a little anxiety around this for people. There are people that this is part of their routine, their spiritual rhythm, and they're really feeling the itch to be back to church and be back together. So during this time, as we're away, how should Christians feel about meeting with their families in smaller groups in their homes? How should they feel about their faithfulness as they're foregoing our large assemblies and meeting in smaller groups in our homes with our families? And Lauren, we'll start with you on this one.
I do think this connects really nicely with the conversation we were just having, because this is another one of these ways in which faithfulness is not about, it doesn't always look the same way. Maybe, we have to really discern what God is calling us into. And so I think this is another one of these kind of examples where neighbor love requires that we not gather in large groups for a while. And I think it actually makes a lot of sense that we're discovering in the midst of this that we need each other. That I think in a lot of ways it's been really helpful that, and I have a little visitor here. It's helpful that we're discovering through this that we need the communion. We need to see each other in person. I'll let John Mark hop in while I deal with this issue real quick.
What's his name?
This is Abel.
Hey, Abel, how are you?
Hey, Abel, good to see you. We're meeting in homes. Sounds pretty biblical to me. I don't know that there's anything inherently incongruent here. What I would want to suggest is that even though we are assembling in disembodied ways, we're assembling. We three are together right now. We're assembled.
Yeah.
And we're communicating, and we're actually even able, by the grace of technology, to see each other and to see Abel come in and say hello to Abel. So it's a community, right? And communal things happen online in this kind of setting as well. But what's more important, even than necessarily the embodied presence or the connection, is what Paul describes as the communion of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And it is the communion of the Holy Spirit that really constitutes assembly, or constitutes the reality that we are embracing in this moment. So, for example, I tell my church all the time that when we gather as a community in embodied ways, we are not only gathered with those we can see, we are gathered with those we can't see as well. We are gathered with the whole church all over the world. We are gathered in the spirit with the church in Singapore. We're gathered in the spirit with the church in New York, because the communion of the Holy Spirit gathers us, right? And it brings us into the presence of God. And by the Spirit, we are united around the throne of God, not only those who are present in your home, but those who are present in the next home, or in the park, or in the next city over, or around the world, and with the angels that are gathered around the throne. and with all those who have gone before us that are around the throne. This is why the church in liturgy sings holy, holy, holy every week, because we're joining the chorus. And that chorus is an angelic chorus, and it's the chorus of all the saints. And we do that every Sunday. We do that every assembly, whether we are embodied with them or not. Because it is by the Spirit that we worship. We worship in the Spirit. And so in that sense, what is really important is still happening.
Yeah.
It's different, but it's not empty. Now, I'm all for going back, I want the embodied as well, because I think there are things that do happen in the embodied context that can't happen online.
Yeah.
But I don't think doing it online or doing it in homes is necessarily deficient as much as it is different.
Yeah.
And we receive different gifts from each of those. But it's not empty either way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think this is an opportunity to realize that community of the Holy Spirit, to embody that more. One of the things our folks have done, some of our members have told me that when we get on Facebook Live or the Vimeo, however they're watching our live stream that week, is that they'll see other people pop on and they'll imagine them sitting in their seat, And I think that's a really cool way to do it, to get that feel of community while we're at home, but also it's a time to remember the church more universal as it worships around the world. We can embody that. We can think about that more. And the angels that worship with us and the saints that have gone on before us, this is a time to really, for me, I've been able to internalize that more during this time where we've been at home. So cool. Lauren, were you going to add some more before you took over with your number one job there?
Yeah. I love the way that this conversation has taken the kind of pneumatological turn, right? The turn to paying attention to how the Spirit is at work. And one thing that I think, is important when we're thinking about faithfulness, and, one thing I've always loved about our Church of Christ tradition is the importance of the assembly, and not just, we take that really seriously. I mean, getting online isn't enough, So, I normally think that's absolutely right. But in a time like this, when doing this online is the way that we actually show our love of neighbor, then it is enough, because God graces those kinds of efforts, right? And God meets us there. And so this has highlighted all kinds of ways in which we're connected with each other globally. And I think it's nice to be reminded that we need each other, because there's so many things we can take for granted. Right now, I don't take it for granted when I encounter another human outside of my own. If I'm walking in my neighborhood and I see my neighbor, we get to wave to each other. That's like an event,
Yeah.
And so it'll be exciting when we're all back together, and when we get to see each other physically and feel that'll be a celebration. And I think there's a way in which we needed a reminder of this, maybe. So the other thing that I think has been helpful is this has reminded me of all the people that can't, join us physically at the assembly because they're confined to their homes, or they're in, hospice care, or they're in prison, or whatever it may be. That this has reminded us of how we have a responsibility to attend to those people as well. This can be a way of our learning to empathize with them somewhat, that otherwise we wouldn't have had an opportunity to do. So I think we're learning a lot through this.
Yeah. And we're learning, I think, different ways to connect too. Like, I think that there are certain things about the assembly that we're all missing. I know I am. But at the same time, there have been some real strengths about kind of meeting online. As we're talking right now, even, it feels like we're connected. It's not quite the same as being in the same room together, but at the same time, there's something real that's going on here. And I can't help but wonder, after this is over, what we're going to keep from what we're learning right now as we begin to assemble back together. So, well, look, we're going to roll on to our last question here, and we'll start with John Mark and then go to Lauren. And again, this connects on some level to our last question, because at some point we're going to come back together again. I mean, we don't know exactly when. It feels like the dates keep getting pushed back, but we all I feel strongly that we're eventually going to be back together. And so as churches are planning these different phases, and churches are thinking through how they're going to phase back their assembling, getting back into their regular activities, what should they be thinking about theologically as they come back together to go along with the practical steps that they're taking in bringing us back together in our general assemblies?
Well, I think that's a difficult question in some ways, because the situation, we don't know what exactly it's going to become in terms of the practicalities, but just a couple of things here. One is to recognize that this is not the first time this sort of thing's happened in history, right?
Yeah.
Where we come back from a pandemic. I mean, that happened with the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And one of the changes that became pervasive after the Spanish flu, it started before the Spanish flu, but after the Spanish flu, it accelerated this change.
Yeah.
And that change was moving from one cup to multiple cups.
Yeah.
It changed the way we did communion.
Yeah.
I wonder, is this going to change the way we do communion?
Yeah. Yeah.
Until there's a vaccine, or until there's something that can assure the public safety. What kind of precautions do we need to take with communion in terms of our shared life together?
Yeah.
And I think it might give us an occasion to maybe make some changes for the better.
Yeah.
To change our form in a way, just as we changed our form before from one to multiple cup. Are there ways in which a new experience of communion or a new form of communion, a new way of doing it, is going to enhance certain aspects of communion? I don't know how that looks, but I imagine church is going to have to start thinking about how they distribute communion, and whether getting in a line and going for the front and getting it from a table that no one's handing it to you, but you pick it up for yourself. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it could give us new windows into what the experience of communion is, just as even now it's giving us new windows into the experience of communion. That communion is not just about our individual event. It's rather a communal event, and how do we make that more communal and think about it in that way? I hope also that part of the theological change here, or the theological reflection, is going to be, now that we're back in the building, what was important about how the church broke out of the building? How can we continue to be the church outside the building and keep some focus there? The danger will be when we get back in the building that we get building centered again. And being building centered is going to hinder our witness as Christians, because it becomes a fortress, rather than a mission. So I think there's a potential here that we have opportunity to say, okay, we're back in the building, but we don't want to lose some of the things we gained by being outside the building. And how can we bring those two things in balance and see how they help each other, how they inform each other and shape each other, rather than being building focused, as we have a tendency to do. I have a tendency to do that. And maybe there was there's a good meaning to the fact that we've been scattered. We've been scattered into our neighborhoods. And so, as Lauren was saying, we value our neighbor a little bit more. We value seeing our neighbor and being with our neighbor a little bit more, instead of, I don't need to know my neighbor, I go to church. I get church is my family, my community. And I don't really need to connect with the people around me. Maybe we can learn some things about that from this experience.
Well, Ashley, my wife, the other day was out playing in the front yard with our kids, and ended up having two conversations with a couple of our neighbors that she doesn't talk to all the time, just because everybody's just so happy to see each other during this time. John Mark, I think that's really insightful. I think of as we come back, I've even thought that when we come back, I think people might even have, because I know we're planning on keeping our streaming service and all the steps that we've made to bring up and have a quality one. We want to keep all that in place when we come back. And some of our folks may feel liberated to stay at home a few more times, not if they're rushing at the house to get done and they're wrestling with kids, or they've got a sick kid at home. It might be that instead of mom just staying at home or dad just staying at home with that child, they all stay at home and worship together as a family. And I think if we're telling them it's legitimate now, there's a level where it's got to be legitimate on the other end of this as well. And so we've been thinking about here, what do we do to make these connections when we're not assembling together, and how can we focus more on equipping so we can kind of keep this going out into our neighborhoods? And I also really like what you said. It's funny what you said about communion, because the week before we totally disbanded assembly, we changed the way that we did communion the week before, simply because we were trying to think about maintaining a sanitary environment for everybody, not passing anything along. And then the next week, it was apparent that we weren't going to be meeting together for a long time, but we moved to tables in the back. Everybody got their communion. They prayed together, and it was really a nice change. And it's interesting how these changes can facilitate maybe some moves, some changes in the form that might actually stay closer, get us a little bit closer to the community event that communion is meant to be. I talked a lot there. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I'm anxious to hear what Lauren has to say.
Okay. All right, Lauren. Well, you're up, Lauren.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of great stuff. I love that you're making the connection. Well, there's several connections I think are really important. I'm glad, Grant, that you brought up the question of how we're going to use our tech after we come back together, because this is something that we've been discerning as well at Otter Creek. We've been talking about how can we be really intentional in the way that we are framing our use of the technology as a way of virtually being together in such a way that communicates the importance, and actually it's extremely important that if we are able to be together physically in person, that's the ideal, because there's so much that happens. And for instance, in receiving communion, as we're adapting, one thing I don't want to lose is the sense of receiving it from my brother or sister as a gift, that I'm invited to the Lord's table, I'm receiving, I'm being served, we're serving one another, and so there's a way in which I can only experience that when I'm actually serving someone, rather than let's say I live alone and I stayed up too late on Saturday night and I'm not going to make it. I mean, it's great that I want everyone to have that option, and I think we can now make our services available in ways that we hadn't before. But to talk about what is our ideal, what are we called to as Christians? What happens when we come together in bodily presence, when we encounter one another? So I just think, I don't know, I don't have the answers for this. I just think it's so important that we ask these questions about what it looks like to do this well, and to do it in such a way that facilitates the kind of encounters with one another that are theologically formative for us, right? And the other concern, a little bit of a concern I have around the heavy reliance on virtual gathering, is that there are a lot of people that this crisis has highlighted, that there are a lot of people who don't have access to virtual technology because of their economic situations. And so if we become overly reliant on it, which I can't imagine any of us are thinking this way right now. And yet I don't know, it's just something I want us to bear in mind when we think about, that's something that's important as we're thinking about how this plays out in the life of our churches and our communities, that we think about the people that when we say, you can catch this online, or you can catch our streaming of this, that doesn't apply to them, right? Because that's not, that kind of technology isn't available in their homes. And then also in terms of getting out of the building, something else that's been I think kind of nice about all of this, kind of a bright side, has been the way it's pushed all of us outdoors in general, out of our houses. And so, so many Americans, North Americans are getting to know not only their neighbors in terms of the people that live around them, but also I'm getting to know my animal neighbors, right? Like I'm getting to know we have all these turkeys in our neighborhood right now. And like, we are good friends with these turkeys. We're always out on walks, and we're noticing so much that we don't typically have time to absorb, or we're busy doing other kind of social interactions. So I love the idea of us thinking about ways of taking our church services outdoors. We could find ways to be in nature together more, and then that sense of connection with the creation is at the heart of the human vocation that God has called us to be those who tend to the creation and take care of it.
Yeah, I like that point, Lauren. That's a good point about creation and connection with neighbors. I hope your husband doesn't have a shotgun and turkeys and want some food or anything, but you know how that
could
works.
have a bunch of visitors from Mississippi up in your neighborhood.
Yeah, well, they're protected because we live right near Radnor Lake. But I think if we didn't, there might have been some bow hunting that would have already happened around here. I can't say that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, but I appreciate the point. I think that's why I said it's different, but it's not empty. It is different.
Yeah.
And there's something that happens in embodied presence that can't happen online.
Yeah.
It's body language, it's full body language, it's touch, it's eye contact, it's relationships, it's the kinds of conversations that you have kind of standing around. Because you don't have those in these online environments for the most part, especially if you're just watching a service, right?
Yeah.
You don't have that kind of conversation happening. You don't have that kind of community happening. And I think there is something really valuable about being with a person's embodied at a table, being around a table together, whether you're eating a meal or whether you're praying together or having a conversation together or just picking up the bread and wine off the table together.
Yeah.
Something happens there that doesn't happen online. So it's online experience is, I think, effective.
Yeah.
It's effective in the spirit.
Yeah.
And we can worship in the spirit this way, especially when circumstances are demand it because of mercy. So we don't, humanity was not made for the Sabbath, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah.
Humanity was how'd it go?
Yeah.
The Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. No, it's the other way around.
Yeah, it's the other way around.
So it's that principle, right? It's that principle. So in these circumstances, okay, this is effective. It works. It serves a purpose and it's meaningful. It doesn't need to be diminished or ditched, but embodied is better.
Yeah.
And there's something that happens there that doesn't happen here. At the same time, I think Lauren's point is very well taken, that there are people who are shut-ins, who are unable to meet in embodied ways. And maybe not only does it give us a sense of empathy for them, it also tells us, okay, there's something that can really happen here too for them, even if it's not ideal in the way that I think assembly has the potential to function.
Yeah, that's really good. And I want to come back to what you said, John Mark, but first, I think it's really interesting what you said, Lauren, about nature. It kind of took me down memory lane. My family used to go camping with several other families from our church that went to Mars Hill. I'm not going to name drop them, but you would know them all, Lauren. And I remember some of the worship services that we would have together outside on Cedar Creek, which is out around Russellville area, North Alabama, which is unnecessary information for most people. But I remember those, and my dad would make flyers and he would put them around the campsite, and we would invite people, and we'd have 30 or 40 people show up my dad, thank goodness, would not lead singing, but he would usually preach. And he was a pipe fitter, so it was cool as a kid to hear him preach as a young person. And then later on, those are some of the best memories that I have. And even encounters when I wasn't familiar with that language, didn't really understand what all that meant. There was something different about doing that outside. And I think even of our Christian camp experiences, why that may make those times so special for certain people, because there is a mix of being in God's creation and worshiping together. I think that's really, really rich. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Lauren or John Mark, before I
No,
touch on?
I just love that you're highlighting that about the worship experiences you have. You know, you remember those growing up. I'm the same way.
Yeah.
And did you go to Maywood? I feel like you did.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think that's something else we have in common.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I mean, I just think, you know, this is something that I appreciate. Again, thinking about our tradition, the simplicity. One of the advantages of the simplicity is that we can easily take it outside, right?
We
We don't
travel
have,
light.
yeah, we travel light. We don't have a lot to fuss with in terms of accoutrements,
Yeah.
and I think that's a pretty cool thing that we can use. That means we can easily adapt, and then in addition to that, there's that added benefit of that sense of our place in the creation, our sense of connection to it, our sense of, and if this whole thing has highlighted nothing if not that we are vulnerable and as part of creation, right? That we don't have as much control as we like to think we do, and that's one thing I think that is a healthy lesson you learn when you spend time outdoors. Is you learn a kind of healthy respect for the creation itself, and you don't imagine that you can just control it and dominate it all the time the way we tend to when we sit inside all the time and don't think about going outside.
Yeah. When I take my walks in the morning, that's one of the things I notice that I didn't notice, just all the things are, even in my neighborhood, all the things that are growing and how little understanding I have of, and even scientists, I mean, when it comes to photosynthesis and all that stuff, there is so much that we don't know. And all this stuff is happening all around us. It's really kind of majestic and really transcendent when we step back and notice it and think about it. John Mark, last thing, both of you touched on this, and Lauren especially touched on the economic side of it, which I hadn't thought of as much. And then John Mark reminded us of our shut-ins and our folks that may not have the access, how we can connect to them. And I agree with you guys. There is something that happens in the assembly together that just can't be replicated online. And I appreciate you drawing attention to that. Feels like there was another question on the tail end of that I was going to point out, John Mark, but I lost it as I was framing it up. So
Hey, that's okay. It happens to me all the time, bro.
yeah. Well, look, thank you guys so much for this. It's been really rich for me. And just kind of last thing, bonus, Lauren, is there anything additional you'd like to tag on at the end here?
I don't think so. I've really enjoyed being with you guys, and it reminds me of the goods that come with this kind of, we're really blessed to have, I think John Mark said it, like the grace of technology, which isn't something I say very often. I tend to be kind of curmudgeonly about technology and it's ruining us, so, but through all this, I've learned, even new ways of connecting with my students through, some of these social media platforms that I, again, tend to be curmudgeonly about, but yeah, so there's so many ways that God can move us towards new ways of communing with one another that we're getting to learn through this. So I'm grateful.
Yeah. I remembered what I was going to notice, John Mark, and then you can touch on this with your closing comments. But even like the millennials and Gen Z, right? We think of them as being digital natives and just really caught up in their electronics and really tech savvy. But survey after survey says that they prefer face-to-face conversations more than they prefer technology. And that's the group that's supposed to be more adept in the digital world than any of us. So I think it's really important that we recognize, even though that this digital stuff, it's good, it does not replace the assembly and being together and what happens there.
Right.
So anyway, John Mark, is there anything?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that point, because I meet with a group of ministers. You know, we regularly meet, and we're doing it online right now. And most of them are 20-somethings.
Yeah.
You know, it's a small group, but they're mostly 20-somethings. And they are so tired of meeting online.
Yeah.
They really want to be together, you know. And I think that's just the human condition, right?
Yeah.
We want to be together. But I want everybody to realize I do know how to quote the Bible, all right? That man was not made for the Sabbath.
Yeah.
No, it's the other way around. Yeah. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? So I just want to make sure everybody understands. I got that in my head somewhere. It just doesn't come out my mouth very well.
I don't know, John Mark. We don't know about you and your knowledge of Scripture, you know.
Yeah, I'm a little confused about it myself at the moment.
Yeah, you don't have any bona fides when it comes to that. So.
No, none at all.
Well, John Mark, is there anything else you'd like to add, or is that your closing statement that you want people to know that you can quote the Bible?
Yeah, I want them to know that I got that verse correct. Okay, you know, Mark chapter 2, Matthew chapter 12. So you can go check me out on it. But yeah, go read the Bible for yourself. Don't trust me.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you guys so much for this time together. I feel like it was a really rich conversation. It was for me. I hope that you enjoyed it too. So thank you guys for being here. And I hope those of you guys that are watching really enjoy this time that we had together.
Thanks. Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Lauren. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you guys. Thanks.
Thank you.